The moment that letter surfaced, everything changed, not publicly, not officially, but in the quiet, tense corridors where power actually moves. Because this was never supposed to happen. A private visit suddenly turning into a diplomatic ripple. A ripple that insiders now whisper became a warning. And that warning, it didn't stay in Oman. It traveled straight into London and landed like a problem nobody could ignore. And here's where the story takes a turn that feels almost too calculated to be coincidence. Because while the headlines were still busy celebrating carefully framed humanitarian moments, something else was unfolding behind the scenes. Something colder, sharper, and far more strategic. A message, allegedly discreet, allegedly measured, but carrying a tone that insiders describe as unmistakably firm. Not loud, not public, but unmistakable. The kind of message that doesn't need to shout to be heard. And suddenly, the atmosphere shifted because what was once seen as a high-profile international appearance started being reinterpreted as something else entirely. A move, a test, maybe even some are now suggesting a line that was quietly crossed. And once that line was noticed, the response wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It was controlled, structured, strategic. Inside London, doors reportedly closed faster than usual that morning. Conversations that were supposed to happen later happened immediately. Schedules reshuffled, calls placed, and one question began to echo through those rooms with an intensity no one could ignore. How did this happen without control? Because control, that's the word that keeps coming back. Not reputation, not optics, control. And according to insiders, that's exactly what the alleged Jordan communication forced the palace to confront. Not just what happened, but what could happen next if nothing changed. Because if one international visit could blur lines this quickly, what about the next one? And the next? That's when the tone reportedly hardened. Not publicly, never publicly, but internally, it shifted completely. Because suddenly, Meghan's international movements were no longer being viewed as isolated appearances. They were being seen as part of something bigger, a pattern, a strategy, a presence that, depending on who you ask inside those walls, was starting to move too independently, too confidently, too globally. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because the palace has always operated on one invisible rule: alignment. Every move, every visit, every handshake, aligned, controlled, understood. But what happens when someone steps outside that system and still carries the weight of a title? That's the tension. And insiders say that tension exploded into urgency the moment that alleged letter was acknowledged, not because of what it said directly, but because of what it implied. That other countries were noticing, questioning, asking quietly, who exactly are we dealing with here? And that question, it's dangerous because the monarchy doesn't just rely on tradition, it relies on clarity. And the moment that clarity starts to blur, everything becomes vulnerable. So the response wasn't about headlines, it wasn't about defending anyone, it was about tightening the frame, narrowing the boundaries, re-establishing something that insiders now say had started slipping: control over representation. And this is where things start to feel almost surgical, because the changes being whispered about aren't loud or dramatic, they're precise, subtle adjustments that taken individually might seem small, but together they redraw the entire map. Embassy access, carefully reviewed; international coordination, quietly restricted; unofficial engagements, suddenly not so easy to facilitate. Not a ban, not a public statement, nothing that would spark outrage on the surface. But beneath that surface, a recalibration, a tightening. And the timing, it's what makes people look twice. Because this didn't happen months later. It didn't take years of buildup. It happened fast. Almost immediately after that Jordan episode started raising questions, which leads to a question that insiders won't answer directly but also don't deny. Was that letter the trigger? Or was it simply the moment everything became impossible to ignore? Because there's a difference. One suggests reaction, the other suggests realization. And if it's the second, then this isn't just about one visit. It's about a shift that had been building quietly for a long time, finally reaching a point where something had to give. And what gave wasn't access. It wasn't visibility. It was freedom. Because what insiders are now hinting at is something far more significant than a single policy change. They're describing a scenario where every future international move becomes monitored, not publicly, not obviously, but strategically, watched, assessed, interpreted before it even happens. And that changes everything. Because once movement becomes monitored, spontaneity disappears. Independence shrinks. And what once looked like global influence starts to feel like something else entirely. Managed. And here's the part that no one says out loud, but everyone is thinking. If this level of control is being tightened heightened now, what pushed it to this point? Was it really just one visit? Or was that visit simply the moment where multiple concerns, multiple patterns, multiple quiet frustrations finally collided in a way that could no longer be ignored? Because the palace doesn't move like this without reason. It doesn't tighten without pressure. And it definitely doesn't act this quickly, unless something behind the scenes made it absolutely necessary. And that's where the story starts to feel unfinished. Because while the public sees images, smiles, carefully framed moments, the real story is unfolding somewhere else entirely. In rooms without cameras, in conversations that don't get leaked, at least not fully, where decisions are made not about what's already happened, but about what must not happen again. And if insiders are even partially right, then what we're seeing now isn't the end of the fallout. It's the beginning of something much more controlled, much more deliberate, and possibly much more restrictive than anyone expected. And what makes this even more unsettling is not what has already been tightened, but what insiders claim is quietly being prepared next. Because once a system begins to close in, it rarely stops at the first adjustment. It expands, it refines, it builds layers, and that is exactly what whispers from inside London are now suggesting that this is no longer just about one alleged letter or one controversial visit. This is about a full recalibration of how influence itself is allowed to operate when it exists outside the official structure, but still carries the shadow of it. And that shadow, according to those watching closely, has become the real issue because it confuses, it blurs, it creates moments where governments, institutions, and even foreign royal courts are left asking a question they should never have to ask. Is this official or is this personal? Is this representation or is this branding? And when that question starts appearing in diplomatic spaces, the reaction is never soft, it is precise, it is controlled, and it is designed to prevent the question from ever being asked again, which is why what is being described now feels less like a response and more like a containment strategy unfolding in real time, because sources are now hinting at something even more calculated, a system where future international movements are not just observed but quietly pre-cleared in invisible ways, where doors that once opened easily now require layers of silent approval, but where invitations are no longer just invitations but checkpoints, and where every appearance carries an unspoken evaluation before it even happens. And if that sounds extreme, that's because it is meant to be felt that way, not publicly but internally, because the palace does not operate through chaos, it operates through control disguised as tradition. And when that control feels threatened even slightly, the response becomes methodical, almost surgical, cutting off uncertainty before it has a chance to spread. And insiders are now describing exactly that kind of surgical shift, where embassies are being reminded of their boundaries, where diplomatic staff are being quietly briefed on what support should and should not look like, and where the definition of non-working royal is no longer just a label but a framework with real consequences. And suddenly, what once felt like global access begins to shrink into something far more conditional, far more limited, and far more deliberate. And yet none of this is being announced, none of it is being declared, which is what makes it even more powerful, because the absence of public confirmation creates a strange silence. And that silence itself becomes part of the strategy, because when rules are not spoken, they are harder to challenge, harder to debate, and easier to enforce quietly. And this is where the story takes on a different kind of intensity, because it is no longer about what is visible, it is about what is felt behind the scenes, the sudden hesitations, the delayed responses, the invitations that don't arrive, the meetings that never quite get scheduled. And each of those small moments begins to form a pattern that insiders claim is already starting to shape the next phase of how Meghan's international presence is experienced, not blocked, not erased, but subtly redirected, contained within boundaries that are never openly explained but clearly exist. And the deeper you look into this, the more it starts to feel like a quiet power struggle unfolding in slow motion, not between individuals but between systems, between a traditional structure that demands alignment and a modern presence that operates independently. And when those two forces collide, the result is never simple. It becomes layered, complicated, and often invisible to those watching from the outside, which is why what we are seeing now feels incomplete, like a story that has only revealed its surface while the real movement happens underneath. And perhaps the most revealing detail of all is not the alleged letter itself, but the speed of the reaction that followed, because speed suggests urgency, and urgency suggests concern, and concern, when it reaches this level, rarely fades away quietly. It evolves, it deepens, it reshapes the rules rules in ways that only become clear over time, and that is exactly where this story now sits, not at a conclusion, but at a turning point, where every future move, every international appearance, every carefully staged moment will be viewed through a different lens, a lens shaped not just by public perception, but by internal recalibration that has already begun. And the question that now lingers quietly but persistently is not whether control has been tightened, but how far it will go, and whether the next move will reveal just how much has already changed behind those closed doors. Because if this was the response to one controversial moment, then what happens when the next one arrives, and the system that has already begun tightening decides it is no longer enough to adjust, but necessary to redefine everything entirely?